comes a new challenger.
What's up, YouTube? ChallengerTCG is back with another tier list video. Colin and I just got back from Bologna. We've got a lot to talk about today. We're going to be updating our tier list from our original speculative tier list that we talked about before the set released and with what we had for in testing. And now we've had a lot of data from the Chinese events and also the first event in the West in Bologna. And so we did have some champions move up and down in our tier list. We did have some things that we definitely predicted right. And we have a few things that I think we got wrong. And so we're going to talk about those today. And we're going to give you the up-to-date tier list leading into Las Vegas and what we think are going to be the best decks in Vegas. As you see here, we still have plenty of cards still in the metal card side quest. We're not really going to talk about these again. The conversion rates kind of speak for themselves. We also gave our opinions on these the last time. We talked about them a little more in the last tier list. So if you want to check that one out for our opinions on these, go for that. But some legends you'll see have snuck out of the metal card side quest from last time. So those are going to be probably placed somewhere else, and we'll talk about that as we get into the tier list. But yeah, just so you know, we're definitely not talking about these. And Garen, what do you know? Still in Garen tier, hasn't changed. So
yeah, I think he unfortunately will be stuck there pretty much forever. But
yeah,
you know, who knows? Maybe we'll get a Garen too at some point.
Yeah, they would have to give him a really broken chosen champion, I think, to even get him into the metal card side quest here. So starting us off, our first legend we're going to be talking about is the big baddie, the big boss, the final boss of this format, Draven. Draven, we put an S tier last time at the very top, and nothing's changed. He is still the top of S tier by far. I mean, even being played far less at Bologna than he was in China, his conversion rate was still insane for the amount of Draven that was actually being played. We did see Draven not enter into the top 4, and so I know a lot of people were like, oh look, maybe Draven's fallen off, but the numbers may have fallen off. But if you look at how well this deck was converting, he's definitely still the best deck in the format, the best legend. Colin played it to some success this weekend, so I'm going to throw it over to him so he can let you know why we believe that Draven is S tier.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that both variations of Draven are S tier in our mind, whether it be the Miracle version or the mid-range version, both of which made top 8 in Bologna. I think they are both excellent versions of Draven as a whole and are going to be the best deck in the format, in my personal opinion. Now, that being said, as Anton mentioned, the conversion ratio was insane, 2.23% or something like that, higher than any other legend in the entire format. I think what Draven provides is a kind of like a baseline level that you have to be able to get over in order to get to these top placements. And as we saw in the top cut, there are a few things that can compete with Draven, whether it be the Ezreal deck that is able to kill all of his units out of combat, Viktor that's doing the same thing. He is just such a meta warping and defining deck that if you're going to run into him, if you aren't prepared to kill his stuff out of combat, then you're going to struggle. Draven on his side, both the mid-range and the Miracle, just provide such a strong chosen champion, strong signature spell, strong leader ability that it's very difficult to contend with for the majority of decks. So I expect for Draven to continually be the best deck in the format, for my personal opinion, and something that you're always going to have to consider. Even at the low play rates that we saw in Bologna, with him only being 15% of the field, once we got to day 2, he was closer to 40% of the field, just because of how powerful the deck is into the vast majority of the field. So yeah, definitely keep an eye on Draven, and if he is your favorite legend this set, then I would definitely recommend playing him in either way, shape, or form.
Next up on the tier list, we've got Misfortune, the Bounty Hunter. Misfortune we originally had in A tier. We did end up moving her down to B tier. Now, we did see Misfortune make it all the way to the finals of the event. I played Misfortune in Bologna, and I do think that it was a good meta call for the event. I think that it has a very good matchup into mid-range Draven. Probably one of the more favorable ones that you're going to be able to get into mid-range Draven. The problem with the deck still is the same problem that it had in set 1, where you are just, even more so I'd say, you are really all in on Aurora this set. The game has just moved into such a pace that you can't get away with just like holding up a 7 or 8 might guy, and that's not really going to do the the job anymore. Purple got even more tools to deal with big units like this, and purple is everywhere. You know, that is the domain that always gave you the most struggle in set 1, but there wasn't really a lot of chaos legends in set 1 that were dominant or strong enough to compete with these big guy decks. But now most of the decks in purple can all play whatever they want, and they play just this new purple engine, and they can find all their answers, and all of their answers deal with your cards way too effectively. So unless you can get the Aurora online, which you can do a little more quickly thanks to Called Shot, you can just fold like I did in my last few rounds. The deck just literally didn't draw Aurora 4 games in a row, and I ended up losing my 2 rounds. So because of the all-in nature of the deck, I do think that while it is really powerful, and if you're running really hot, you can do really well with it. You could take it all the way to the top tables, even into the top cut, as this gentleman did. I do think that it does fail a little bit more than I'd like it to, and it's just not as consistent as doing the other miracle things or other broken purple stuff. So we moved it into B tier. I do think MF is still a very viable choice, not quite as strong as some of these other purple legends.
For sure. She definitely struggles a little bit as a anti-meta deck into some of the top tier decks that we'll see as we get later on in this tier list. But when you're going into a field as wide as this one, given all of the middle cards being the primary focus for decks and people to want to play for, it does create kind of an issue if it's just a matchup roulette, as on top of your own deck roulette, and you're wanting to need to see the Dazzling Aurora to participate in the game.
Next up on the list is Kaisa. Last time we did have Kaisa next to Draven in S tier. We have since moved Kaisa down into the A tier. Of course, this deck is still really powerful. No surprise that she'd still be high up here. She does have a pretty solid Draven matchup with singularities and other things like that, but wouldn't even say it's a great Draven matchup, just a playable one. And Kaisa, the problem with Kaisa nowadays, I feel, is that she's had to warp so much to face Draven that she lost a lot of the edge that she had into these other decks. Bigger guys definitely give her even more of an issue now without cleaves and things in your deck. So Collin, what do you think about Kaisa in A tier?
Yeah, we originally put her up in S tier with Draven just because we believed from a conceptual angle that she was the best thing to deal with Draven, being able to kill all of this stuff outside of combat. That ended up not being the case once the Draven lists adapted a little bit more to that style. So that's pretty much what everyone's trying to do. And when you know that everyone's trying to counter you with a specific style in pretty much any card game, then you can make some sort of adaptations to deal with that. And that's something that we've seen of the highest performing Draven lists that were all pretty similar to the ones that I've recommended in my guide in our Discord. So that being said, if you go first game 1, then there's nothing Draven really can do into a singularity, and that'll be enough to pretty much seal the game on the spot on turn 3. So I think that she still performs particularly well there, and previously she was the deck that was keeping a lot of these lower tier decks down and in the lower tiers because they couldn't deal with Kaisa, and she still is doing that. There's still so many decks that cannot deal with the singularity, cannot deal with the falling star. These cards are so inherently powerful because when they work and do the thing that they're designed to do, then you just get set so far behind on tempo. So if you aren't playing, a not so fast or buff spells or something that can actually counter these spells, then you're not going to have a good time with Kaisa. Her biggest weakness is definitely the Irelia problem, as her Irelia matchup is pretty difficult. But if you're able to dodge that matchup, then she has a playable matchup into pretty much every other deck in the field. So
next one is Jinx, the loose cannon. We've moved Jinx all the way up to B tier. We had Daniel do pretty well on Jinx, as well as some of our Discord subscribers. We had a lot of Jinxes actually make it into day 2. We had a lot of Jinx show up, and really this is just based on the fact of how good the Fury Chaos Miracle is with battering rams. I mean, this deck just vomits massive amounts of might onto the board. It's doing it at such an insane rate, and really it doesn't even matter. Like, the Draven draw matters a little bit. It definitely comes up here and there, but your deck just naturally draws so many cards that you're going to see your whole deck whether or not you're winning combats or not. And so basically any deck in this color combination can just run this engine and do these really insane things. and there's just not a lot of things that the fair decks can really do into that. Like, it's just an even more insane amount of might being put onto the board at an even faster rate than Dazzling Aurora could do, except it's also just able to play like a regular mid-range game as well if it is like kind of stalling out or breaking a little bit. So yeah, this deck is just still really insane. More people playing Nocturnes have even accelerated how much might is hitting the board now. Clearly, a lot of people made it to a very respectable record, making even top cut qualifying for the regional with Jinx. And we went from literally having her so unplayable in set 1 to being an actual contender for making top cut, and that just goes to show how crazy this Fury Chaos engine is.
Yeah, it does definitely struggle in not being quite as good as the Draven variation of the same deck, but it does have a couple of unique things going for it. Namely, the Jinx Rebel Chosen Champion is quite nice. You can do some shenanigans with your traveling merchants in order to continually untap her and move her around, similar to like a Darius or something of that nature. That can be very annoying to pin down, especially on the Zonwarn's game where you're able to constantly retreat her back home. And Super Mega Death Rocket is also quite the inclusion in that deck, just being another discard outlet for your Jinx, and you can just completely spawn camp some of these Draven decks and other decks out of the game by just cycling it over and over. As we mentioned in the purple engine, you're never low on cards in hand, so turning all of them into a Super Mega Death Rocket can be quite annoying for some of these decks to deal with.
Next up, we've got the Swift Scout Teemo. Teemo managed to make it into B tier. Still feel that this deck is pretty good. I know Collin talked to me a little bit before we put this list out, mentioned that there was potential to have this guy in C tier instead of B. I did feel that we should still probably respect the Miracle package enough to put this guy into B. He's definitely not nearly as good as Ezreal in the same color combination, mainly because Ezreal can start with Ezreal, which is one of the most powerful engine pieces of this Miracle engine, as his chosen champ, whereas Teemo cannot. Teemo does have a few cute things going for him, but Collin, why don't you let us know why we put Teemo in B tier and why you believe that there could be an argument for him being a little bit lower?
Yeah, as previously mentioned, Jinx at least has a couple of unique things compared to Draven as to why you would want to run her over Draven, even if the pros do not outweigh the cons. With Teemo, I think we're definitely a little bit more limited on compared to Ezreal as to why we would want to play this chosen champion. Typically, these decks aren't really built to hold anymore, as holding into a deck like Draven is a complete nightmare. I played against a Teemo in Swiss, and every time they would try and set up some sort of hold with all these hidden cards, and then you just play a Bryn Here Thunder Song, and the game is over on the spot, right? So I think that's what a lot of the issues are with the traditional Teemo strategy, is that it's just not functional into purple as well. If you only have a solo unit onto a battlefield and you're relying on maybe your Bandle tree with multiple hidden cards, and I just fight or flight you out, I don't have to think about what any of these hidden cards are. The game plays itself, let alone if you're playing into Kaisa and Singularity or Falling Star. All these things are quite the nightmare for you. That being said, it is still in a very, very strong color combination of Chaos and Mind, and that gives you access to some of the best cards in the game. I just believe that he's kind of on the lower end just because there's not much of a reason to play him right now as opposed to the other legend in this color combination.
Next up, we've got our first legend making it into the C tier. She has graduated up a rank from last time. We have Ahri. Ahri was very well represented in Bologna, though I do think that a large part of that had to do with her being the best of card that ended up selling for the most in set 1. And so I think a lot of people were chasing that bag coming into set 2, trying to win the Ahri, thinking that it's the most valuable of the metal leaders. And it does actually have a pretty decent Draven matchup. I remember Collin testing that into us pretty early on, between Thwonks and the new Janna. Your Sona plays are so much more impactful now than they were in set 1. I do think that also plays a role into it. I know when I was playing Aurora, and I did end up queuing into some Ahris in the day 1 and day 2 event, and they just weren't really doing much into Aurora, of course, so it is still one of those decks that I think can struggle into some of these other unfair decks, but does have a solid Draven mid-range matchup, and definitely a leader that still converted well despite having such a large showing. Whether it was for the metal card or not, it actually did convert decently enough that we think it deserves getting bumped up.
Yeah, her new additions from set 2 out of most of the set 1 leaders, I think, she probably got the most power from the previous, or from the new set, as opposed to her previous iteration. But I think that strategy is just very difficult to do right now, of trying to hold battlefields into Miracle Draven or even Classic Draven. That's being one of your best matchups. And even then you can struggle if you end up losing the dice and go second. Her biggest issue as to why I honestly wanted to run her too, but I could not solve the Irelia matchup. That matchup is an absolute nightmare for Ahri, and there's not really much that can be done. So beyond that, like Anton said, if you run into Aurora deck, you're cooked. It's just kind of going for a matchup roulette whenever you're playing a deck like this. So, but I think her ability to beat Draven in certain situations, and that matchup not being terrible, is enough of a reason to take her a little bit out of the middle card side quest alone.
Next up, we've got Viktor. We did have Viktor in the A tier in the last one as well. We have since moved him down into the B tier. We did see Viktor was able to make top 8 at Bologna. I mean, that was out of 1,700 players. Definitely an impressive feat for a deck like this. We do think that there's some merit to Viktor. I think it still definitely has some really solid matchups. Like, there's some decks that really struggle into the Call of the Week game plan. You have the Singularity, which is a card that just still really punishes mid-range decks. And so Viktor definitely has strong tools to deal with things in the current format. Obviously, it's shown that it's playable enough to get into the top cut slot, but its conversion rate wasn't super great, and I do think that it warrants going down a bit in tier. Collin, what do you think about Viktor?
Yeah, he has been a kind of consistent threat, being one of the only legends that can guarantee you a turn 1 play every single time. We've seen originally people playing the Viktor spells only deck and just trying to control the battlefield using all the spells that color combination has access to. But as time has gone on, we've seen even out of our teammate Cody, who was the best of Viktor in Houston, and now this best of Viktor here in Bologna. They're going more towards the traditional hybrid style of having both units and spells, just because when you're all in on spells and such, it can be difficult if your opponent knows how to play around it and have their deck built accordingly. So I still think Viktor has been solid. The combination of Imperial Decree plus Bella's Breath is something that's difficult for any deck to actually deal with. And that's a potent thing, especially when backed up by the aggression that Viktor is able to put out early.
Next up, we've got the boss, Collin's ex-pet deck. We have still put the boss into C tier. I mean, I do think Sett is still doing powerful things in his legend, though I do think that just struggles a little bit into the chaos colors. This set being so prevalent again, as we said, and the chaos kind of just countering holds again, as well as just hold decks in general, struggling into Draven. Collin, what do you think about the boss in this format?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a shame, as I do love Sett from set 1, obviously, as being my pet deck. But going into the current meta of all chaos all the time, I think it is definitely a bit too much of a hard counter for our boss here. And that is where he certainly struggles. But it was nice. I talked to pretty much every Sett player that was there, just because they recognized me and came up to say hi. So they said that the list that I provided actually ended up doing them pretty good. I believe one of them went either 10-3 or 9-4 on the list that I outlined in the guide. And it really just came down to exactly that chaos decks are certainly a struggle for Sett to be able to perform and put up these numbers. But he is quite the anti-meta deck, in my opinion. So pretty much all the decks that are trying to beat up on Draven are going to struggle when you are able to just continually save things over and over again. So I think he does have a niche in this meta of, not being able to handle the miracle decks very well, or Draven in particular. But if you're running into a world full of Kaisas that are just on all the spells, or even Ezreals, I believe, you can really make things work for you.
Next up, we've got the Dark Child Annie, still locking herself into A tier. As we mentioned, the Miracle deck is just insanely powerful, and Annie does have a slightly more relevant line of text on her legend than Jinx does. Jinx does have some interesting pieces, as Colin highlighted earlier, like the Rocket and the Purple Jinx champion, though Annie's champion is also extremely good too in this Miracle deck. You're often running a lot of these techie one-ofs, so being able to pick back up your Rebuke after you've used it, or Guns, or any of these other techie one-ofs that you want to play in your deck can be really powerful. And of course, the threat of always having something up, especially after you've like vomited your whole hand out, you played all your battering rams and Rosses and stuff, and then you can still hold up a piece of interaction every single turn, is really strong. I think Annie's still a really strong deck, and if you're thinking of playing Miracles, but you're not wanting to join the Dravens as far as having to compete for a metal card, I think Annie's a solid choice as well.
Yeah, we also did see a top 16 out of the Annie deck that I think only had like 2 or 3 new cards in it, which was quite funny. It was just the traditional set 1 Annie list. So I think her versatility is why we have decided to put her this high, and that, as Anton mentioned, you can just play the broken Draven Miracles package if you want. You can build her as a Draven cosplay in the mid-range side, where you're also just getting an extra 2 energy for all of your fighter flights or rebukes or switcheroos or any of these spells that you might want to cast. Hard Bargain especially is a complete pain for your opponent to have to deal with. So this version has merits, or again, you can just play the same set 1 Annie that we had previously, like the person who made top 16 with the listed. So I think all of these reasons give Annie a solid position here in the metagame, and that's why we rated her so highly.
Next up, we've got Wuju Blademan Master Yi. Master Yi, we did go ahead and keep him in the C tier. I do think that this deck is once again just struggling in the fact that, just like Ahri is a hold deck, and it's just really hard to play hold decks in the current format if you're planning to queue into a lot of purple, mostly Draven of course, because he'll punish you even worse, but just having to be on the battlefield is such a liability when there's a lot of rebukes in the format and things like that, especially if you're trying to play bigger guys, which is kind of where Master Yi was shining in set 1. I do think that Aurora Yi is still viable and even got a little bit of tools, but it's just really hard into the purple decks to play a deck like that. You can't really just play big guys anymore because of cards like Switcheroo, cards like Rebuke, even Fighter Flight to a lesser extent, but at least you get to keep your guy with Fighter Flights. But it's just a hard deck, but I do think Master Yi is still pretty good. We saw some mid-range Yis also making it in to day 2 and as well, so I think Yi is still a decent enough deck. Definitely fallen a lot from set 1.
Yeah, he has kind of adapted in towards this camel playstyle, but as we've mentioned previously, that just isn't scary enough to handle decks like Draven, who can easily get to large enough might numbers to beat over something like that. And that's assuming that you even need to go to the battlefield that the camel is located at in the first place. So
next up, we've got Lux, Lady of Luminosity. Lux did have a decent enough showing at Bologna, actually making some into day 2. Again, having access to the very powerful combination of Imperial Decree and Bellows Breath, that's really good into all these miracle decks, or just even into the mid-range decks, like being able to clear an entire board worth of investment for only 7 energy is really powerful. I do think, of course, that Viktor having the ability to spawn a token every turn to actually score points gives him a little bit of the edge over Lux, but the card draw is actually becoming more and more relevant, and I do think that this color combo has some merit. Lux's chosen champion, given that there's a lot less Falling Star in the format, is actually a little bit more viable now this time around, so that energy actually can become relevant for a spell deck. You could even play the Bellows combo on turn 3 if for some reason you really needed to do that. So I think that Lux was earned her spot jumping up from Metal Card Side Quest to C tier, just because this color combination is kind of powerful right now. Any thoughts, Colin?
yeah, we actually saw that Alexa was starting out day 1 at 7-0, eventually losing to Prismat in the final round, putting them at 7-1 going into the next day, and then I think they went 2-3 on day 2 to get the Lux medal best of. But that being said, it's still got its niche. I think it's, again, struggling similarly to how Viktor does, where if your opponents know how to play around it, it can be difficult when you're just holding up a bunch of energy each turn and hoping that they send units into you so you can cast your spells. But that is at least a uniquely interesting enough strategy that, especially while you're just continually spitting out units with a Vanguard Armory, that it can certainly work.
Next up, we've got Relentless Storm Volibear, who has also graduated into the C tier. I did think Volibear had potential to be C tier on the last tier list, and I had been testing this deck a little bit, though I did end up getting off of it towards the end. Collin actually lost to it in Swiss, getting pretty luck sacked by multiple turn 3 Auroras, but nonetheless, that is something that this deck can do, and the deck also got access to like very powerful cards like Ferris Forerunner. So I think Volibear is definitely a deck that can contend because it has a reasonable enough matchup into Draven and can always do the Broken Aurora thing. It's kind of like Yi in set 1, where you could actually play a regular, ramp guy, big guy, mid-range game, and then you just have this I win package in Aurora versus something like MF, where you are all in on finding your Aurora and you kind of crumble if you don't, which I think gives Volibear a little bit of an edge. Of course, he's nowhere near as powerful as these other Aurora decks because of how much less consistently you actually find your I win combination of cards. Any thoughts on Volibear, Collin?
Yeah, this was actually one of the decks I ended up losing to in Swiss. As embarrassing as it is, that is Draven mid-range's worst matchup is anything with Aurora, just because the game is completely out of your hands. If they have the Aurora early enough, then there's nothing you can do. And unfortunately for me, my opponent did exactly that. So I do think that if you want to play an Aurora deck, Volibear is a viable option. Its biggest issue is that it's less consistent at finding its Aurora compared to a deck like Misfortune, but when it does, it's very powerful, especially given that it has the free Sky Splitters to help prevent you getting stuck by dying to units. But yeah, Aurora as a whole will always struggle into the Miracle decks, and apparently even Ezreal was able to cook it, given that Misfortune lost to Ezreal in the finals.
Next up, we've got Purifier Lucian. We have Lucian sitting in the C tier. Lucian's still struggling a bit, of course. The combo version, as we mentioned before on the channel, is pretty strong, but we did actually kind of get some clarification on Lucian's signature spell. Now knowing that this thing requires equipment to be in play, it doesn't make it so much more weak, but it does make the card a little more weaker, which was unfortunate for Lucian because this deck was already kind of struggling into the current format. Any thoughts on Lucian, Collin, as far as being C tier?
Yeah, we've tested it a bit, and there are a couple of variations of Lucian if you like these aggressive styles of decks. The biggest issue whenever you're playing that sort of style is he's significantly weaker going second than he is first. Lucian does get to remedy that a bit, given that he's probably the best chosen champion to have for turn 1 going second, but you also have to build your deck in such a way that you're taking advantage of that, and once you end up doing that, then all the 2-drops in your deck just become dead, and that's never really where you want to be. The combo is quite nice out of Lucian when you're able to assemble the Spear plus Triforce, and that's what we saw out of the best of Lucian. I was able to make it quite far, actually. I ended up in the last round looking to the left and seeing the best of Lucian that was there gaming out, so it was quite cool to see, even though I believe they ended up losing the last round. So if you like doing some tricky combo stuff, then Lucian is probably one of the more interesting decks at doing that, but its biggest weakness is just assembling the combo, and then if there's any level of disruption, then he definitely does not have a great time.
Next up, we've got the Void Burrower Rek'sai. We have Rek'sai up in the bottom of B tier now. We did have a lot of Rek'sai representation actually in Bologna. We did have Alex ending up on X4 with the deck, was able to make day 2, so definitely a contender in the format. I do think that Rek'sai is really powerful. It does have a very powerful legend ability and has some really powerful play patterns. Not really enough to give it much of an edge in the current format, but definitely enough that it can gain a lot of resource advantage, and it does have so much removal that is actually gives it a pretty solid matchup, not only into Draven, but also into Irelia. And I think that that's why Rek'sai is a contender in the B tier.
Yeah, Rek'sai has its place as kind of a anti-meta deck, or anti-meta deck, something to that nature, where you're not particularly great in a Draven, given that they're able to play Ferris Forerunner, which is your biggest nightmare card out of Rek'sai. But into the rest of the decks, like Irelia and stuff, I know talking to Alex, he smoked every Irelia that was out there. 2-0'd every single one just because they can't really handle Cold a Week. Plus you get access to cards like Thermo Beam and such out of the board, and as soon as you clear their whole board, the Irelia deck is just nothing but buff spells. So if they don't have units, there's nothing they can do. So I think that the deck is solid. You also get to generate tons of value with your legend ability every single turn, looking at the top two and playing whatever card is best off of those. So I think it's one of the better aggressive tempo decks, I would say, where you're just kind of trying to throw every rune, every card, every unit that you possibly can of your opponent and take them off the board before they know what hit them.
Speaking of Irelia, next up we've got the Blade Dancer. We ended up throwing Irelia into the A tier again. She was A tier last time, though we have pushed her above Kaisa this time around. Do you think that the conversion rates kind of show that? We did have more Kaisas show up than Irelia's, but Irelia did end up converting better into day 2. The deck is just really hard for Kaisa to deal with. It's got a really solid matchup into these other control decks, especially decks like Ezreal. It's just really hard when you're a removal based deck to deal with this Irelia card. Any deck that has to target her in general has a hard time. And the deck is also just doing a lot of unfair things. It's able to produce massive amounts of might and make its units really hard to deal with. And even if you're able to deal with it once, then they still have Guardian Angel or Zhonya's to pull it back again. Just can be a really tough time for any control based deck, and it has a fast enough clock because of your legend that you're also able to compete with regular mid-range strategies pretty well too.
Yeah, I think Irelia had the second best conversion ratio of any deck in Bologna, and that's just given its good matchups into the majority of the field. If you thought that your Draven matchup was bad for some of these decks, then let me tell you the Irelia matchup can be so much worse. I think given that the majority of its win condition is in the chosen champ zone, you get to see it pretty much every game, or actually every game, and most decks just can't deal with that when backed up by a Guardian Angel or a Zhonya's or anything of that nature, combined with like all the fighter flights and buff spells that you have out of your hand. There's so many decks that just cannot deal with this Irelia that's moving around to both battlefields, and I honestly worry if they end up hitting Draven a little bit too much. Draven is one of her worst matchups, given that they're often playing Brynhir Thundersong and Rebukes and Fighter Flights and all this stuff, that Irelia will just become even more dominant as a solo best of deck here in the formats. I have been told that Ezreal with Vexes, as we saw as the first place list, can deal with Irelia as well, so maybe my fears won't come true, but it is certainly one of the more frustrating decks in set 2 to play against, as it just feels like there's nothing you can do once they've played either their Draven or their chosen Irelia, and are just protecting it with all the Guardian Angels, all the buff spells, all the not so fast, all the set fighter flights. It can be very difficult to deal with. But if you like that tricky style of moving your unit and kind of going all in on one unit, that boggles style that we've seen out of Magic, then Irelia can definitely be the deck for you.
Next up, we've got Emperor of the Sands Azir. We do still have Azir sitting in the C tier. And we did see this deck get to the finals of one of the regionals. I do think that player had an excellent run with the deck. I do think it struggles a lot into many other decks in the format. It's just doing kind of a very fair thing. It can get some really good spots with its deck that can definitely beat a lot of these mid-range decks. It still has a lot of these powerful yellow spells like Call the Weak that gives it solid edge into decks like Irelia or the mid-range Draven maybe. But overall, it's still just a token deck. Its guys are not so big that Draven can't run over you, so giving up tokens, even though they're not real cards, you are still giving your opponent real cards to draw off of their Draven. And I do think Azir is still struggling a little bit, but definitely better than Metal Card Side Quest.
Yeah, I ended up playing into Azir as well throughout my Swiss run, and it definitely was not able to handle a properly built Draven list, as they don't really have the balance for cards like Ferris Forerunner. They play on low hand size, so cards like Mind Splitter definitely end up cooking them, and they're just kind of all in on making sure that their signature spell is enough to end the game on the spot. So that's the only unfair thing that they're able to do, is slam that Sig spell. And yeah, outside of that, they're just playing some slightly above costed units, but when you're in a world of all these removal spells that don't really care about what the might of your units are, then that deck is going to struggle, as things can just be taken off the board so quickly when you're Bellows Breathing plus Thousand Tailed Watcher or out of Kaisa with all the singularities and stuff. The deck is a token deck, but it's typically only making 1 unit a turn, given that it's restricted by its Legends ability. But if you like that style of just making a token that continually gets bigger and bigger and bigger with all the equipment, then it's certainly an interesting deck.
Next up, we've got the Battle Mistress, Sivir. Sivir did not make it into any top cuts this time around other than the Chinese regional, but in Bologna it did have a pretty good representation, and we definitely had a lot of people asking us when we put out the tier list last time and the 5 best decks video. We had people asking us why we were putting Misfortune in there, and I do believe that Misfortune is the superior Aurora deck. However, Sivir can also play just this Miracle Rasa package, and Confront is a much better Bushwhack. So I mean, that deck has access to a very nice Bushwhack combo. It can do a lot of the same things that the Miracle deck can do. It doesn't have access to Battering Ram, of course, but the gold generation on Sivir for your called shots and just to pay more of these power costs is a real ability in the Miracle version of this deck. So we do think Sivir deserves a slot at the bottom of A. Any thoughts, Colin?
Yeah, I originally very much so underestimated this deck, just given that it has a terrible mid-range Draven matchup, and Miracle is probably also pretty bad for it. But as I've talked about and alluded to with a couple of the other decks that are in the format, Sivir is definitely the best of the anti-Draven lists, and that she is going to be your best option running into decks like Kaisa or Ezreal or any of these sorts of things, because her entire strategy revolves around sabotaging your opponent 5 to 6 times over the course of the game between the actual sabotages themselves plus your copies of Fizz, and completely destroying all these spell-based decks that are trying to counter Draven by killing all of Draven's units outside of combat and preventing them from drawing those extra cards. So I do think that if your opponent knows what they're doing, then the Sivir deck will severely struggle into a deck such as Draven, or even some of the Aurora decks I could see being a problem if they aren't able to sabotage the Aurora in time. But just because its biggest issue is that it can't really deal with a 6 might unit on a battlefield, right? But outside of that, whenever you're playing against these decks that aren't built to hold, then Sivir is going to absolutely demolish them with the amount of hand disruption that you're able to put out.
Next up, we've got the Grand Duelist Fiora. We did have Fiora graduate up into C tier. This deck did get to the finals of some Chinese regionals. I don't think I saw much of it converting in Bologna, but this deck definitely does still have some powerful play patterns if it can get its engine online. This deck actually does draw its Baited Hook in the Baited Hook versions, I think that variant of the deck actually can be very strong. But just like in set 1 with Darius Hook, it's in a color combination that really doesn't draw a lot of cards, doesn't really have a lot of way to dig through your deck, so you don't find your Baited Hook super often, and then your deck is just kind of doing a slightly underpowered thing or just a very fair thing, and that's when the Fiora deck just kind of falls apart. But it does have some decent enough play patterns that I think it keeps itself out of the side quest here. Any thoughts, Colin?
Yeah, this is obviously Sett's color combination, so I've been asked a lot of Sett v Fiora, which one's better, but I think they're just doing different things. Fiora is, I think, in our opinion, the best Baited Hook deck right now, and trying to use all the extra energy that's generated off of Fiora in order to continually fuel your hook can definitely remove a lot of the downside there. And there are a few decks that can deal with constant Harness Dragons and such coming off the top. Also having a very strong signature spell as well as Chosen Champion is quite nice for her. The main issue typically is that when you're playing this deck, if you don't hit properly on time, you aren't hitting the right units on the right turn, then you're going to struggle for sure. So I do think the traditional weapon Fiora mid-range deck is a little too fair, kind of similar to Azir, as we previously mentioned, where you're playing in a format where people are able to drop 20 to 30 might on turn 2. and you're just trying to play these equipment and 4 might, 5 might units, like that's not going to end very well for you. So I think she's a cool deck, but definitely going to be on the bottom side of the tier list for as long as these miracle decks are allowed to exist.
And for our final legend to talk about, we've got the Prodigal Explorer Ezreal. We were getting memed on a little bit because we did put Ezreal in C tier, and we're willing to admit that yes, we probably did underestimate Ezreal a good bit. When we did play early on with this deck, we did notice the purple engine right away. I mean, that was one of the first things we started testing, and we saw how busted it was that you could draw through your whole deck. But the problem with Ezreal was that it's kind of struggling to find its win condition. And I do think that the deck still kind of does feel that way. I do think that the deck is really powerful, but I can tell you there were so many people going to time with Ezreal. Even a lot of other competitive players that I was talking to were like, yeah, I think that this deck is the best deck in the game, but it goes to time too often. And that reason that it's going to time too often is because, just like we said in our first tier list video, that it just struggles to actually find ways to win the game. But if you are an experienced player with the deck, and if you really understand your play patterns well and can move through your game actions quickly and make sure that your opponent is also moving through their game actions quickly, then I do think that the deck is extremely powerful in what it does do. It draws a ton of cards, not only with Ezreal, but with this purple engine. And you'll have a really powerful Sig spell that interacts really well with cards like the Watcher and Mind Splitters. You're able to just clear boards with the Bellows Breath and things like that. We did have Alonsky kind of re-innovate the deck a little bit by adding in these Vexes, and that definitely made the deck play in a different way that we had not really tested into, and definitely fixed a lot of the issues with the Irelia matchup. So I do think with a lot of those things in mind that it makes sense for us to move Ezreal all the way up to the A tier. I still personally would make an argument that maybe this guy is a little bit lower, but I'm not going to argue with the current results, and Collin felt strongly that it should be an A, so that's where we're going to put it. Collin, if you want to clarify some of your thoughts, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to a field of doing unfair things, Ezreal is one of the few decks that's able to punish your opponent for overextending, as the Watcher plus Arcane Shift plus Bellows Breath combination ends up being very similar to the Imperial Decree plus Bellows Breath combination that we've seen out of the Order plus Mind decks, except that we're in Chaos instead of Order, and that lets us see our entire deck every single game. So whereas into the blue-white decks, you're always wondering, well, do they have it? I can't win the game through the Imperial Decree plus Bellows Breath combo, but it's not that likely that they have this 2-card combination, and sometimes you can play through 1, but usually it's when they get 2 that the game is out of reach. But when you're in Chaos, fortunately for anyone on the Ezreal deck, you get to see your entire deck every game. So it's never a question of if they have it, it's a question of when they will actually end up using it. And it can be very difficult for the players to navigate through the minefield that is, I know that they're going to Watcher plus Bellows Breath me and then be able to Arcane Shift plus Fizz next turn and continually do this over and over until I've lost the game. If you're unable to apply enough pressure or hand disruption or anything of that nature, or take these units off the board, then eventually you're just going to succumb to them completely wiping your board every single turn. So I do believe that Ezreal deserves an A tier. I wouldn't particularly put it higher given the difficulty of playing this through a 60 minutes with 3 turns of overtime type of event, especially if you're to run into a miracle opponent where you're both just cold shotting 3 to 6 times a game. Like, you're going to struggle to actually make it through a tournament. But it is a very, very powerful deck given what we've seen. And yeah, it's definitely something we underestimated a bit.
And that's going to be it for our tier list. Let us know in the comments below if you guys disagree with anything we said. Keep in mind, this is our predictions going into the Las Vegas format. And if you guys see us at Vegas, we should be wearing our Challenger TCG shirts. Feel free to come up to us. We love talking to you guys. We love meeting people who are enjoying our content or learning from us. If you like what we're doing here, please leave a like on the video. If you want to see more videos like this, go ahead and subscribe. And if you want more from us, you can find us in our Discord. Check us out on Metafy if you want access to that. We will see you guys in Vegas. Hopefully we'll be taking home the trophy this time around. So catch us there. Later. Challenger TCG is now powered by TopDeck.gg. TopDeck.gg is the tournament software you want to be using when hosting any tournament. It has instant pairings, a robust mobile app, integrated payments, and an easy-to-use interface, all for just $12 a month. You can get a free 14-day trial right now if you want to try out the software, and use promo code CHALLENGER for an additional month free of charge. If you decide you want to keep the software, use promo code CHALLENGER25 for a 25% discount off your yearly subscription plan.